Dr. Alistair Finch was a man who loved answers. For most of his life, he believed that if you had a question, you could find the solution in a book, a research paper, or through a carefully designed experiment. This belief was the foundation of his work as a professor of cognitive science. His office was a testament to this, a quiet, slightly messy space filled with books, journals, and the soft, constant hum of a computer analyzing data. But lately, the answers on his screen were troubling him. It was late. The university outside his window was dark and silent. The only light came from his monitor, displaying a graph with sharp red lines climbing steadily upwards. For months, he had been studying the sleep patterns and stress levels of his own students. The results were clear and they were grim. A significant number of them, especially in the weeks before exams, were experiencing severe anxiety and insomnia. They reported lying in bed for hours, their minds racing, unable to switch off. At first, Alistair thought it was just the normal pressure of university life. But the data told a more specific story. It wasn't just studying that was keeping them up. It was what they did when they stopped studying. They would pick up their phones. They would scroll through endless news feeds filled with bad news, wars, political arguments, climate fears. They would fall into rabbit holes of social media, comparing their messy lives to the perfect highlights of others. They were consuming a fire hose of information, but it was a chaotic, frightening, and endless stream. Knowledge was supposed to set you free, Alistair thought. But for these young people, it was building a prison in their own minds. They were more connected than any generation in history, yet they felt more lost and alone in the dark. He leaned back in his creaky chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He felt a heavy weight of responsibility. He had spent his career telling students to seek out information, to be curious, to learn. And now, that very path seemed to be leading them to a cliff of exhaustion and worry. His own life wasn't immune. He remembered trying to fall asleep the previous night, only to find his own brain churning with thoughts about a difficult research paper, a departmental meeting, and a nagging worry about his elderly father's health. He, too, had reached for his phone, hoping for a distraction, only to get sucked into a long article about a new virus strain. He had finally fallen asleep out of pure mental exhaustion, but it wasn't restful sleep. It was a surrender. This was the problem he needed to solve. It wasn't enough to tell people to just put your phone away. The desire to know, to be informed, to not miss out, was too strong. It was a modern instinct. Fighting it was like fighting the tide. He looked at a photograph on his desk. It was a picture of his 7-year-old daughter, Clara, from a few years ago. She was fast asleep in her bed, her head resting on a pillow shaped like a crescent moon. He remembered her bedtime routine with a sudden vivid clarity. Every night she would demand a story. Not just any story, but the same one told in the same calm, gentle voice. It was a simple tale about a little bear finding his way home. There was a moment in the story where the bear, after being lost and a little scared, sees the friendly light of his home cabin window through the trees. Every time at that exact moment, Clara's breathing would slow, her eyelids would grow heavy, and she would drift into a deep, peaceful sleep. The story worked because it presented a small problem, a lost bear, and then resolved it in the safest, most comforting way possible. It gave her brain a sense of closure. The mystery was solved. Everything was okay. A powerful idea began to form in Alistair's mind, connecting the frantic students to the sleeping child. What if the anxiety people felt from their phones wasn't from the information itself, but from the lack of resolution? They were being fed a constant diet of terrifying questions with no answers. What if this new virus is the big one? What if the economy collapses? What if I'm not good enough? The digital world was brilliant at asking scary questions, but terrible at providing satisfying final answers. It left people hanging in a state of perpetual alarm. His hypothesis was counterintuitive, almost heretical for a scientist. What if you could use knowledge not to stimulate, but to soothe? Not to wake the mind up, but to gently put it to rest? He imagined a different kind of content. Instead of doom scrolling, what if it was peaceful learning? Instead of open-ended fears, what if you presented closed-ended mysteries? Not the unsolvable, frightening mysteries of the future, but the great enigmas of the world that science had already solved. He pictured a narrator with a calm, steady voice, telling a story. The story would always follow the same pattern. It would start with a question that would have baffled or terrified people in the past. Why do the stars shine? What was that strange illness that made people dance in the streets until they collapsed? What are those giant bones we find in the ground? Then, the narrator would guide you, step by logical step, through the journey of discovery. The false starts, the clever experiments, the eureka moments. And finally, you would arrive at the elegant, evidence-based answer. The mystery would be resolved. The story would be over. The mind, having followed a puzzle from tension to resolution, could finally relax. It would get the cognitive closure it desperately craved. He opened a new document on his computer. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, his tiredness replaced by a spark of excitement. He typed a working title for his ambitious, perhaps crazy, new project, 100 Enigmas. That knowledge has explained. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't know how he would find the enigmas, or the narrator, or the audience. But for the first time in months, looking at that title, Dr. Alistair Finch felt a sense of hope. He was no longer just studying a problem. He was beginning to imagine a cure, and the cure was hidden in the very thing that had caused the sickness. It was all in how you told the story. The idea was a tiny, fragile seed in Alistair's mind. It felt exciting in the quiet of his office, but in the cold light of the next morning, surrounded by the buzz of the university, it felt a little silly. A scientist, a man who dealt in hard data, was now thinking about bedtime stories for adults. He sat through a departmental meeting, nodding along as his colleagues discussed grant proposals and research papers. All the while, his own thoughts were elsewhere. He was mentally testing his hypothesis. If the problem is endless, unresolved anxiety, could the solution be a story with a clear, satisfying ending? Later that day, he met with his most trusted research assistant, a sharp and pragmatic young woman named Maya. He laid out his idea, feeling a bit like a child explaining a dream. He talked about the student anxiety data, his daughter Clara's bedtime story, and his concept for closed-loop knowledge. Maya listened intently, her brow furrowed. She didn't laugh, which was a good start. Instead, she asked the hard question, "So you want to fight the fire of bad information with more information? Isn't that just adding fuel?" "It's about the type of fuel, Maya," Alistair explained, leaning forward. "The stuff online is like throwing wet, smoky leaves on a fire. It creates a lot of choking smoke and panic, but no real light or heat. What I'm thinking of is like a single well-made candle. It gives a steady, calm light, and then it burns out cleanly. It doesn't leave a mess." He could see the skepticism in her eyes. "A candle," she repeated, deadpan. "Okay, fine. It's a metaphor," Alistair said, running a hand through his already messy hair. "But think about it. What's the most common reason people give for watching a relaxing TV show before bed? To turn their brain off? But what if we aren't turning it off? What if we're just giving it a specific, simple job to do, one that has a clear finish line? Once the mystery is solved, the brain can clock out for the night." Maya was quiet for a moment, tapping her pen on her notebook. "So you're not trying to make people dumb or stop them from thinking. You're trying to give their thoughts a satisfying conclusion." "Exactly," Alistair said, feeling a surge of relief. She got it. It's like a cognitive pacifier. Not in a condescending way, but in a biological way. The human brain is a problem-solving machine. If you don't give it a problem to solve, it will invent its own. Usually, "Why is my life a mess?" Or "What if something terrible happens tomorrow?" And we would just be giving it a better, safer problem. One that we already know the answer to. Now, they had to move from theory to practice. The first and biggest challenge was the list. What exactly were these enigmas? This was harder than it sounded. Alistair and Maya spent an entire afternoon in the lab, whiteboard covered in possibilities. "Okay, what about the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle?" Maya suggested. Alistair shook his head. "No, that's the opposite of what we want." "Why?" "It's a famous mystery." "Precisely. It's famous because it's not solved in the public mind. It's shrouded in myth and speculation. We need mysteries that are conclusively, undeniably explained. The solution must be more fascinating than the mystery itself." He went to the whiteboard and drew a line down the middle. On one side, he wrote open-ended and anxiety-inducing. On the other, he wrote closed-loop and satisfying. "See," he said, pointing. "Bermuda Triangle? Open-ended. It leads to thoughts of aliens and supernatural forces. Not helpful, but—" He moved to the other side of the board. "The mystery of what caused the sinking of the Titanic? For decades, people thought it was just a gash from the iceberg. Then, sonar and metallurgy explained it was a series of brittle fractures caused by cold water on weak steel. Mystery solved. The story has a beginning, a middle, and a definitive end. That's what we want. They began to build their canon. It couldn't be a dry list of facts. Each enigma had to be a story. They needed questions that would have kept an ancient king or a medieval farmer awake at night, but that a modern person could now know the answer to with certainty. What are the strange lights in the sky we call the northern lights? Solved. Charged particles from the sun colliding with our atmosphere. How did the ancient Egyptians build the pyramids? Solved. Not by aliens, but by brilliant engineering, massive workforces, and simple tools like sleds and ramps. What causes the plague that wiped out half of Europe? Solved. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread by fleas on rats. Why do we have seasons? Solved. The tilt of the Earth's axis, not our distance from the sun. Each time they found a perfect enigma, it felt like a small victory. They were archaeologists of answered questions, digging up the bones of old fears and laying them to rest with the facts. But Alistair knew the list was only half the battle. The words on the page were just a recipe. The voice that delivered them would be the meal. It had to be perfect. It couldn't be his own voice, which still carried the hesitant ums and ahs of a lecturer. It couldn't be a dramatic movie trailer voice that would hype up the mystery. It needed to be the audio equivalent of a warm blanket and a cup of chamomile tea. He remembered a documentary series he had watched years ago about the deep ocean. The narrator, a woman, had a voice that was so calm and authoritative, so effortlessly clear, that he found himself less scared of the monstrous anglerfish and more in awe of the world. He had to find her. A quick search revealed her name, Eleanor Vance. She had been the voice of several celebrated nature and science documentaries, but had retired quietly a few years ago. Finding her contact information took some digging, but finally he had an email address. Sitting at his desk that evening, Alistair stared at the blank email. How do you pitch this? Dear Ms. Vance, I'm a professor who thinks your voice could be a sedative for the internet age. He deleted that. He started again, keeping it simple and real. He introduced himself, mentioned the specific documentary he admired, and then laid out his problem. He wrote about his students, their anxiety, and his theory about cognitive closure. He described the list of enigmas they were building. He ended with a simple, heartfelt request. I believe the right voice could turn these scientific explanations into a tool for peace. I wondered if you might be willing to help us try. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The next few days were a lesson in patience. He checked his email constantly, the hope in his chest slowly deflating. Maybe the idea was too strange. Maybe she was too busy. Maybe he sounded like a madman. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, a reply appeared in his inbox. The subject line was simple. Your project. His heart hammered against his ribs as he clicked it. The email was short. Dr. Finch, it began. Your email was the most interesting thing I've read in years. Most people want a voice to excite and energize. You want one to calm and reassure. That is a fascinating, and I think a very needed idea. I am intrigued. Let's talk. Alistair read the message 3 times. A slow smile spread across his face. The seed of the idea had just found its first ray of sunlight. The phone call with Eleanor Vance was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 a.m. For the 2 days in between, Alistair felt a nervous energy he hadn't experienced since he was a student defending his own thesis. He rehearsed what he would say, pacing around his living room, explaining his project to the silent furniture. He wanted to sound professional, but not cold. Passionate, but not unhinged. When Tuesday morning came, he sat at his desk, the phone on speaker, a notepad filled with frantic scribbles in front of him. He took a deep breath and dialed. The voice that answered was exactly as he remembered it, but warmer, more personal. Dr. Finch? This is Eleanor Vance. Please, call me Alistair, he said, his own voice sounding a little tight. And thank you so much for taking the time. The pleasure is mine, she replied. I must say, your email stuck with me. I've been thinking about it all weekend. This notion of cognitive closure, it feels very true. They started with the science. Alistair explained the data from his students. The spike in cortisol levels correlated with late-night scrolling, the brain's desperate search for patterns and answers in a chaotic digital world. He talked about it not as a dry academic, but as a concerned teacher who saw the human cost behind the graphs. Eleanor listened, interjecting with thoughtful questions. "So, you're not trying to stop the thinking process," she clarified. "You're trying to complete it." "Yes," Alistair said, thrilled that she understood it so perfectly. "It's like giving a song its final chord. Without it, the music just feels anxious and unresolved." Then he told her about Clara. He felt a little vulnerable sharing such a personal story, but he pushed through. He described the little bear story, the moment of resolution, the deep, peaceful sleep that followed. "I realized," he said, "that we never outgrow that need for a good story that tells us, it's okay. The bear made it home. The world makes sense." There was a soft smile in Eleanor's voice. "That's a beautiful way to put it, Alistair. So, where do I fit in?" This was the moment. "The words on our list are just notes on a page," he explained. "They need a voice to become music. They need a tone that is calm, certain, and trustworthy. Not a voice that shouts about how amazing the mystery is, but one that gently explains how beautiful the solution can be. I believe your voice can be that final chord for a restless mind." He held his breath. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Alistair," Eleanor said slowly, "for 30 years my job was to make science exciting and dramatic, to make the viewer lean in. You're asking me to do the opposite. You're asking me to make science so comforting that the listener can lean back and drift away. That is a profound shift, and I think it's a wonderful challenge." "I'm in!" A wave of relief and excitement washed over Alistair. They had their narrator. A week later, Alistair and Maya found themselves in a small professional recording studio in the city. It was a strange, hushed space, unlike anywhere Alistair had ever been. The walls were covered in strange foam shapes, killing all echo, creating a silence that felt heavy and intimate. In the center of the room, a large, sophisticated microphone stood like a mechanical sentinel. Eleanor Vance arrived exactly on time. She was a woman in her late 60s with kind eyes and a posture that spoke of a lifetime of careful composure. She shook their hands with a firm, warm grip. "It's lovely to meet you both in person," she said, her speaking voice just as calm and clear as it was on the phone. They had chosen 3 enigmas for this first test recording. The first was The Mystery of the Dancing Plague of 1518, where people in a French town literally danced themselves to exhaustion. The second was The Mystery of the Sun's Power. The third was a simpler one, The Mystery of Why Cats Purr. Eleanor settled into the chair in front of the microphone, putting on a pair of reading glasses. The sound engineer, a young man named Leo with a very quiet demeanor, gave a thumbs up from behind his glass window. Alistair and Maya sat on a worn leather couch in the back, holding their breath. "Okay, Eleanor," Leo's voice came through the speaker. "We're rolling whenever you're ready." Eleanor looked down at the script for the first enigma. She took a slow, quiet breath, and then she began. Her voice changed. It wasn't just reading. It was a performance of utter tranquility. She started the story of the dancing plague not with drama, but with a gentle curiosity. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into the street and began to dance. She guided them through the fear and the confusion of the townspeople, but her tone never became fearful. It was like a wise grandmother recounting a strange tale from long ago. She presented the old theories, curses, demonic possession, not with mockery, but with a gentle acknowledgement of human fear. Then she pivoted. "But modern science," she said, her voice dropping to a comforting, confidential tone, "has offered a more earthly and perhaps more tragic explanation. Researchers now believe it was a case of mass psychogenic illness, a perfect storm of extreme stress, famine, and religious fear, a fever of the mind that spread through a community, expressing itself in this bizarre, exhausting dance." She explained the science of stress-induced trance states with the same soothing rhythm one might use to recite a poem. She wasn't just giving facts. She was resolving a centuries-old fear. "And so," she concluded, her voice soft as a sigh, "the mystery of the dancing plague was not one of magic, but of the very real and sometimes overwhelming power of the human mind under duress." "A mystery solved," she finished. There was absolute silence in the control room. Alistair looked at Maya. Her eyes were wide. He realized he had been holding his shoulders up to his ears, and he consciously let them drop. a deep sense of calm settling over him. Leo's voice broke the silence over the speaker. "That was perfect, Eleanor. I've got chills, or the opposite of chills. I feel incredibly relaxed." They moved on to the next enigma, the mystery of the sun's power. Eleanor began. "For thousands of years, humans worshipped the sun as a god, a fiery chariot crossing the sky. But what was that fire?" She then walked them through the journey of discovery, from simple combustion to the awe-inspiring concept of nuclear fusion happening at the sun's core. She described how, every second, the sun turns millions of tons of mass into pure energy, a process so vast it was impossible to imagine. "But here is the beautiful part," she murmured, her voice full of wonder but devoid of alarm. "That same process here on Earth has been understood. It is not magic, it is physics. The great roaring fire in the sky is, at its heart, a gentle, continuous transformation of one thing into another, giving us light and life." About halfway through this explanation, Alistair noticed a soft, rhythmic sound from the couch next to him. He turned his head. Maya was fast asleep. Her head was tilted back against the leather, her mouth slightly open. Her breathing was deep and steady. The frantic, always-on research assistant, who lived on coffee and deadlines, had been completely disarmed by a story about nuclear fusion. Alistair didn't wake her. He just looked from her peaceful face to Eleanor in the recording booth, who was now smiling softly, having seen the same thing through the glass. This wasn't just data on a screen anymore. This was real. The idea worked. The cognitive pacifier wasn't just a theory. It was a key, and Eleanor's voice had just turned it in the lock. They had found their candle in the digital darkness. Now they just had to see if it could light the way for anyone else. The success in the recording studio was a powerful moment, but Alistair knew that a quiet room with a professional narrator was a world away from a student's messy dorm room at 2 a.m. They had created something beautiful, but would it actually work in the real world? They needed to test it, not just feel it. Back in his lab, Alistair designed a proper experiment. He called it the sleep study. He recruited 20 volunteers, all of whom had officially reported struggling with insomnia for at least 6 months. They were a mixed group, a few undergraduate students, a nurse who worked night shifts, a software developer whose mind was always racing with code, and a new mother who found her sleep shattered by anxiety, even when the baby was finally quiet. The plan was simple. For 1 week, each participant would come to the lab's comfortable, dimly lit sleep pod at 10 p.m. They would be fitted with a portable EEG headband that monitored their brainwaves, tracking how long it took them to fall asleep. For the first 3 nights, they would just try to sleep in silence. This would give Alistair and Maya a baseline. Then, for the next 3 nights, they would listen to the audio recordings through headphones. Maya prepared the playlists. She was meticulous, choosing enigmas that were interesting but not too exciting. No stories about volcanoes or shark attacks. She selected gentle ones. The mystery of the monarch butterfly's migration. How did we decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs? And then the reason for the ocean's tides. The first night of the silent baseline was what they expected. The data scrolling across Alistair's screen in the adjacent control room was a mess of frantic beta waves, the kind associated with active, anxious thinking. The average time to fall asleep was a dismal 42 minutes. Participant number 4, the software developer, took over an hour and a half, his brainwave pattern looking like a city skyline at night. The next night was the first test with Eleanor's voice. Alistair and Maya watched the monitors, the only light in the room coming from the screens, painting their faces in a soft blue glow. One by one, the participants were fitted with the headphones. At 10:15 p.m., the audio began to play. The first subject was a young history major named Liam. His baseline the night before had been 38 minutes. The enigma for the night was the mystery of the monarch butterfly. Eleanor's voice began, calm and steady, describing a tiny insect that undertakes a journey of thousands of miles, a journey it has never made before, to a specific forest in Mexico it has never seen. Alistair watched Liam's brainwave data. For the first few minutes, it was the same jagged, active pattern. He was probably still thinking about his essay or a conversation with a friend. But then, as Eleanor began to explain the science, the role of the sun as a compass, the genetic programming in the butterfly's tiny brain, The lines on the screen began to change. The sharp, spiky beta waves started to smooth out into the slower, rolling waves of alpha, a state of relaxed focus. Then, about 12 minutes into the recording, the pattern shifted again. The waves became even slower and more synchronized, theta waves, the gateway to sleep. A few minutes later, the clear, long, deep waves of delta sleep appeared. Liam was out. 12 minutes, Maya whispered, her eyes wide. He fell asleep in 12 minutes. That's less than a third of his baseline. Alistair felt a jolt of excitement, but he tried to stay scientific. One data point, he cautioned. Let's see the others. But the pattern repeated itself again and again. The nurse, whose brain had been a torrent of stress about her patients, fell asleep while listening to the explanation of the Rosetta Stone. The new mother, who had barely reached a light doze the night before, was in deep delta sleep by the time Eleanor finished explaining how the moon's gravity pulls the ocean. Then there was participant number 7. It was Ben, the software developer who had taken 90 minutes to fall asleep the night before. His enigma was the reason for the ocean's tides. Ben was a naturally skeptical man, a problem solver by trade. Alistair watched his data, expecting resistance. For the first 15 minutes, Ben's brainwaves stayed in a busy alpha state. He was engaged, following the logic. Eleanor presented the historical misunderstanding that the moon's light, not its gravity, caused the tides. She then gently laid out the evidence, the mathematical pull, the bulging of the water. It was a puzzle being solved step by step, and then it happened. Right at the moment, Eleanor concluded, and so it is the invisible, relentless hand of gravity, stretching across 250,000 miles of empty space, that gives our oceans their eternal rhythm. Ben's brainwaves made the abrupt, clean drop into deep sleep. It was so sudden it looked like a cliff on the graph. One moment he was awake and listening. The next, the mystery was solved and his mind simply let go. The problem was closed. The file was saved. His brain could clock out. Maya pointed at the screen. Look at that. It's like a switch flipped. Alistair leaned back, staring at the row of monitors. Nearly every screen showed the same peaceful, slow-rolling pattern of delta waves. The room was silent, but the data was screaming. The average time to fall asleep had dropped from 42 minutes to just under 14. This wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a placebo effect they could just write off. This was a real, measurable biological response. When the session ended and the participants were gently woken for the night, they couldn't let them sleep in the lab. The feedback was just as telling. They didn't say, "That was amazing, I was knocked out." Instead, they said things like, "That was so interesting. I guess I drifted off at the end." Or, "I remember following the story about the butterfly. And then the next thing I knew, you were waking me up." They had experienced the cognitive closure without even realizing it. Their minds had been given a satisfying task, and once the task was complete, the mind had seen no reason to stay awake. Later, as Alistair and Maya were packing up, the lab was quiet. The only sound was the hum of the computers. "It worked, Alistair," Maya said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "It really worked." Alistair looked at the final printout of the night's data. The sharp red lines of anxiety from the first night were gone, replaced by soft blue valleys of deep sleep. He thought of Ben, the software developer, his mind finally at rest. He nodded, a slow, sure smile spreading across his face. "Yes," he said, "it did. We didn't just find a way to make people tired. We found a way to give them peace." The success of the lab study was a triumph, but it was a small, quiet one. The results lived in a scientific paper that only a handful of other researchers would ever read. Alistair knew they had stumbled onto something that could help more than just 20 people in a university town, but he had no idea how to share it. He was a professor, not a promoter. The answer came from an unexpected place, a graduate student named Leo. Leo was the sound engineer who had recorded Eleanor's voice. He was a quiet young man with a passion for both audio technology and the online world. One afternoon he approached Alistair and Maya looking a little nervous. "Dr. Finch," he began, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I've been thinking. The data is great, but what if we could get more? Real-world data?" Alistair sighed. "Leo, we don't have the funding or the facilities for a larger sleep study. The ethics approval alone would take months." "That's the thing," Leo said, his eyes lighting up. "We don't need a formal study. The world is our lab." He held up his phone. I took 3 of the recordings, the ones that are fully produced and sound perfect. The butterfly migration, the ocean tides, and the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Last night I put them online. Alistair felt a jolt of panic. You did what? Leo, that's unpublished research. Those are Eleanor's recordings. I know, Leo said quickly, raising his hands. I should have asked. I'm sorry. But just look. He handed his phone to Alistair. On the screen was a simple, clean web page. At the top it read, Sleep to Science. Below were 3 audio players with the titles of the Enigmas. It wasn't flashy. It looked honest. Where did you post this? Maya asked, peering over Alistair's shoulder. Just on a free audio hosting site, Leo said. I didn't promote it or anything. I just wanted to see if anyone would find it. Alistair scrolled down. Below each audio player was a comment section. His breath caught in his throat. There were comments. Dozens of them. He clicked on the first one. For the mystery of the monarch butterfly. The top comment was from a user named Insomniac Nurse. It read, I work 12-hour night shifts and my sleep schedule is a nightmare. I found this last week and I've listened to it 3 times. I never make it to the end. I wake up hours later feeling like I actually slept. Thank you. Alistair scrolled further. Another from Anxious Coder. My brain usually races with bug fixes and deadlines. This gave it something else to focus on. A problem that actually gets solved. I was out before she even explained the sun compass thing. Unreal. And another from Dad Off a Toddler. I haven't had a full night's sleep in 2 years. I put this on last night after the 3 a.m. diaper change. I was so sure I'd be up for the day, but I actually fell back asleep. This feels like a miracle. The comments weren't from academics. They were from real people with real, exhausting lives. They were nurses, programmers, students, parents. They weren't talking about cognitive closure or EEG readings. They were talking about relief. They were talking about the first good night's sleep they'd had in years. Alistair handed the phone to Maya, his hand trembling slightly. He was a mix of emotions. Anger at Leo for acting without permission, fear about the ethical implications, but overriding it all, a soaring, powerful hope. Leo, he said, his voice tight. You should have asked. I know, Leo repeated, his head bowed. I heard those recordings, and I knew they could help people. I couldn't just let them sit on a hard drive. Maya looked up from the phone, her eyes shining. Alistair, look at this. This is what we wanted. This is the real proof. She was right. The data in the lab was clean and scientific, but this was messy and human. This was the evidence that their idea could travel beyond the soundproof walls of the studio and the controlled environment of the lab and find its way into the messy, anxious, and very tired real world. Over the next week, they watched astounded as the numbers grew. Without any advertising, the Sleep to Science page was being shared. People were sending links to friends and family with messages like, You have to try this. And this worked for me. The comments kept pouring in. A teacher from Brazil wrote that she used it to calm her mind after a hectic day in the classroom. A veteran posted a simple, thank you. The nightmares were quieter tonight. A woman caring for her sick mother wrote that it was the only thing that gave her brain a break from the constant worry. Alistair would sit in his office late at night, reading these stories. He wasn't looking at data points anymore. He was looking at people. He saw the software developer, Ben, in every Anxious Coder. He saw the new mother from their study in every Dad Off a Toddler. He called Eleanor and read her some of the comments. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Alistair, she said, her voice thick with emotion. For all those years I narrated films about saving the rainforest or exploring Mars. They were important. But this, reading that I helped a soldier sleep, that I gave a tired parent a few hours of peace. She paused, collecting herself. This is the most important work I have ever done. Alistair felt the same way. His entire career had been about observing the human mind. Now he was finally helping to heal it. He made a decision. He called Leo and Maya into his office. Okay, he said. What you did was reckless, Leo, but it was also right. We can't keep this to ourselves. Let's do it properly. He gave the project his official blessing. They would create a simple, dedicated website. They would release a new Enigma every week. There would be no ads, no fancy subscriptions. It would be a quiet gift to anyone who needed it. The Sleep to Science project was no longer a university experiment. It had escaped the lab. It had found its way into the world, one tired, restless person at a time, and it was quietly, gently, helping them find their way to sleep. The success of Sleep to Science was a quiet, gentle wave. It didn't crash onto the shore with a roar. It simply washed over people, leaving behind a sense of peace. But in the wide ocean of the internet, every wave eventually catches someone's attention. For Alistair, the first sign of trouble came in the form of an email. It wasn't from a grateful listener or a curious researcher. The subject line was stark: a public concern. It was from a man named Julian Croft, a popular podcaster and author whose books on the world's unsolvable mysteries sold by the millions. Alistair clicked open the email, his coffee cooling, forgotten on his desk. "Dr. Finch," the email began, its tone polite but firm, "I've come across your Sleep to Science project. While I applaud any effort to help people find rest, I am deeply concerned by the philosophy behind your work. You present science as having solved these great mysteries, reducing the awe and wonder of the universe to a set of dry clinical facts. You are, with all due respect, selling a soulless universe." Alistair read the paragraph twice. Soulless. The word felt like a punch. The email continued. "The true magic of our existence lies in the questions, not the answers. The mystery of the pyramids is not made more beautiful by knowing about ramps and sleds. It is diminished. The wonder of consciousness is not explained by mapping neurons. By presenting these solutions as a bedtime story, you are teaching people to close their minds to the profound, the spiritual, and the unknown. You are putting the universe to sleep, and with it, human curiosity." It ended with a veiled threat. "I feel it is my duty to discuss this concerning trend on my next podcast. The public should be aware of both the benefits and the significant philosophical cost of your sedative." Alistair leaned back, his heart thumping unpleasantly. He felt attacked. All he could see were the comments from people who had finally found relief. How could providing comfort be a bad thing? He forwarded the email to Maya and Eleanor with a single, worried line: "We have a problem." Their responses came quickly. Maya was furious. "Who is this guy? He makes money by keeping people scared and confused. Of course he doesn't like us. We're the competition. We're giving people an alternative to being constantly terrified of aliens and ancient curses." Eleanor's response was more measured, arriving via a calm, late-night phone call. "Alistair," she said, her voice a steady anchor, "I've seen this before. Julian Croft is a showman. He sells the sizzle, not the steak. He sells the anxiety of the question. We offer the comfort of the answer. They are, quite simply, different products for different needs." "But he's saying we're killing wonder," Alistair argued, pacing his kitchen floor. "He's saying we're making the world boring. Is the story of nuclear fusion in the heart of a star boring?" Eleanor asked gently. "Is the journey of a tiny butterfly across a continent guided by the sun boring?" "Alistair, we aren't making it boring. We are making it understandable. For a tired, anxious mind, understandable is a gift. It is the opposite of scary." Her words made sense, but the criticism still stung. It tapped into a tiny, hidden fear Alistair had always carried, that by studying the magic of the mind, he was somehow destroying its magic. The following week, Julian Croft released his podcast episode. Its title was, "The War on Wonder, Are We Being Lulled to Sleep?" Alistair forced himself to listen. Croft was a compelling speaker. His voice was smooth and confident. He never mentioned Alistair or Sleep to Science by name, but it was clearly about them. "There is a growing movement," Croft said, his tone dripping with concern, "to explain away all of life's beautiful mysteries, to take the grand epic questions that have inspired poets and explorers for centuries and reduce them to a checklist of facts designed to be consumed passively before bed. This is a dangerous pacifier for the human spirit. It encourages intellectual laziness. Why strive to understand the great unknown if you're told everything is already figured out? Why look up at the stars with wonder if you're told it's just a bunch of exploding hydrogen?" The comments on Croft's podcast were a stark contrast to the ones on their own site. They were filled with agreement. "This is so true," one wrote. "They want to turn us into obedient sheep, unable to question anything." Another said, "Science has its place, but it can't explain the beauty of a sunset or the feeling of love." Alistair felt defeated. Croft was twisting his simple, kind idea into something sinister. He was still brooding in his office the next day when Maya came in, holding her laptop. "Stop listening to him," she said, not unkindly. She placed the laptop on his desk. Listen to this instead. She had compiled a new batch of comments from their own website. She pressed play on a voice note a user had sent. A woman's voice, tired but sincere, filled the room. "Hi," she said. "I just wanted to say thank you. I have an anxiety disorder and my brain gets stuck on loops of what if? What if I get sick? What if I lose my job? Last night I listened to the one about the Northern Lights, and for the first time in months, my what if was about something beautiful. I followed the story of the particles from the sun, and when she explained how they dance with the Earth's magnetic field, my brain just let go. It wasn't that the mystery was solved. It was that the truth was even more beautiful than the mystery." "Thank you for giving me that." Alistair looked up at Maya, his eyes wet. "See?" Maya said softly. "He's talking about a war on wonder. But we're not at war with wonder. We're at war with anxiety. And for the people who live in its shadow, what we offer isn't a prison. It's a key." The criticism didn't go away. A few articles were written, echoing Croft's concerns. But something interesting happened. The controversy, small as it was, brought more people to the Sleep to Science site. And many of them stayed. They discovered that Croft was wrong. The answers weren't an ending. They were a new beginning. Knowing how the stars worked didn't make them less beautiful. It made looking at the night sky a deeper, richer experience. Understanding the science behind the Northern Lights didn't kill the magic. It replaced a vague superstition with a breathtaking cosmic reality. Alistair finally understood. Julian Croft needed the mystery to remain a mystery. It was his business. But Alistair's customers needed something else. They needed rest. They needed peace. And in a world filled with endless frightening questions, a single beautiful answer at the end of the day was not a sedative for the soul. It was a lullaby for a tired mind, and there was nothing soulless about that at all. The public debate with Julian Croft was like a distant thunderstorm for Alistair, uncomfortable and loud, but ultimately not hitting his home. The work continued. The website grew, and the grateful messages from listeners were his daily sunshine, proof that they were on the right path. But life, as it always does, had a way of bringing a problem from the theoretical world right to your doorstep. It started with a phone call from his sister. His father, Arthur, who lived alone in the old family house a few hours away, had been having a tough time. At 82, he was fiercely independent, but his body was becoming less reliable. A bad knee made it hard to get around, and the frustration was making him irritable and withdrawn. "He's not sleeping, Alistair," his sister said, her voice tight with worry. "He says he lies in bed for hours, his mind racing. He worries about his health, about money, about being a burden. I'm really worried about him." A cold knot tightened in Alistair's stomach. His relationship with his father had always been complicated. Arthur was a man of intuition and gut feelings, a retired carpenter who believed in what his hands could touch and his heart could feel. Alistair, with his PhD and his graphs and data, represented a world Arthur didn't fully understand or trust. Their conversations often stalled, two different languages failing to translate. But the thought of his proud, stubborn father lying awake in the dark, haunted by worries, that was a pain Alistair felt deeply. The next weekend he drove to his father's house. The place smelled of wood polish and old books, a familiar scent that always brought a mix of comfort and sadness. Arthur was in his armchair, a newspaper on his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was just staring out the window. He looked smaller than Alistair remembered. "Son," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. They talked about the garden, about the neighbors, the safe, surface-level topics they always stuck to. But Alistair could see the exhaustion etched on his father's face. The skin under his eyes was dark and puffy. "That knee keeping you up, Dad?" Alistair asked gently. Arthur sighed, a long, weary sound. "It's not the knee. It's everything. My mind just won't shut off. It's like a radio stuck between stations, all static and noise." He waved a hand, frustrated. You don't want to hear about an old man's troubles." But Alistair did want to hear. He just didn't know how to help. He couldn't give his father a scientific paper to read. That evening, as they sat in the living room with the TV on but ignored, Alistair saw his father's agitation grow. The static in his mind was getting louder. He was fidgeting, his fingers drumming on the arm of the chair, his breath shallow. An idea, fragile and desperate, formed in Alistair's mind. It felt like a long shot, maybe even a little disrespectful. But he had to try something. "Dad," he said, pulling out his phone. "I've been working on something at the university. It's a kind of audio project. It helps people quiet their minds. Would you like to try it?" Arthur looked at him, suspicion in his tired eyes. "What is it? One of those meditation things? All that nonsense? You know, that's not for me, Alistair." "It's not meditation," Alistair said quickly. "It's just the story. A true story about a mystery that got solved. Just listen for a minute. If you don't like it, we can turn it off." He scrolled through his phone, his heart pounding. He needed the right one. Not too complex, not too childish. He found it. The Mystery of Déjà Vu. He connected his phone to a small Bluetooth speaker and pressed play. Eleanor's voice flowed into the room, calm and clear as a mountain stream. Have you ever walked into a room or heard a phrase and been struck by the powerful, eerie feeling that you have lived this exact moment before? Arthur grunted, his arms crossed. "Happens all the time," he muttered. Eleanor began to guide the listener through the history of the feeling, once thought to be a glitch in the soul or a memory of a past life. She didn't dismiss these ideas with cold science. She presented them as understandable human guesses. Then she gently pivoted. "But modern neuroscience," she said, her voice full of quiet excitement, "offers a different and quite elegant explanation. It suggests that déjà vu is a tiny, temporary hiccup in our brain's memory system." She described how the brain sometimes takes a new experience and, for a split second, accidentally files it directly into the long-term memory folder, instead of the "this is happening now" folder. So, for a fleeting moment, you feel like you're remembering something, even though you are experiencing it for the very first time. "It's not a ghost from the past," Eleanor concluded softly. "It's just a brief, harmless mix-up in the most complex system we know, the human brain." A mystery solved. Alistair watched his father. At first, Arthur's posture was rigid, resistant. But as Eleanor spoke, Alistair saw the tension begin to leave his shoulders. The drumming of his fingers slowed, then stopped. His head, which had been held high with stubborn pride, slowly leaned back against the chair. His breathing deepened. The sharp, anxious lines on his face began to smooth out. By the time Eleanor finished explaining the neural pathways involved, Arthur's eyes were closed. A few moments later, a soft, gentle snore rumbled in his chest. He was asleep. A deep, profound quiet filled the room. The only sounds were the tick of the old clock on the wall and his father's peaceful breathing. Alistair sat there for a long time, just watching him. He didn't feel like a scientist who had successfully tested his theory. He felt like a son who had finally found a way to help his father. This was more powerful than all the data, all the positive comments, all the successful lab studies. This was his father, a man who had never understood his work, finding peace because of it. The project, Sleep to Science, was no longer just a professional pursuit. In the quiet of his father's living room, with the man who had taught him how to hammer a nail now sleeping soundly because of a story about the brain, Alistair understood its true human value. It was a bridge over the troubled waters of anxiety, and a bridge between a father and a son. The quiet miracle of his father's sleep was a turning point for Alistair. It moved the project from his head into his heart. He had seen the data, he had read the comments, but watching his own father, a man who had always been a rock of stubborn strength, find peace in Eleanor's voice, that was a kind of proof no graph could ever provide. He returned to the university with a new sense of purpose. The criticism from Julian Croft now felt like meaningless background noise. He knew what they were building was good. It was real, and the world was starting to notice in a bigger way. It began with an email from a doctor in Tokyo. She had stumbled upon the Sleep to Science site and, after trying it with a few of her own patients struggling with anxiety-related insomnia, wanted to translate some of the episodes into Japanese. Then, a teacher in Germany wrote, asking if she could use the segments in her high school science classes, not to put students to sleep, but to show them the beautiful narrative of scientific discovery. A midwife in Canada started recommending it to new parents, calling it a lifeline for overtired brains. The project was no longer just a website. It was becoming a quiet global tool. Leo, the tech-savvy student, set up a simple map on their back-end dashboard. Little points of light would appear every time someone downloaded an episode. One night, Alistair and Maya stood in front of the large monitor in the lab watching it. The map was speckled with light. A cluster in North America and Europe, of course. But then there were other points shining in the darkness. A dot in rural India, another in a small town in Brazil, one in the middle of the Australian outback. Each light was a story, a nurse in Seoul after a double shift, a student in Nairobi studying for exams, a fisherman in Norway waiting for the dawn. "It's like we're sending out lullabies," Maya whispered, her face lit by the soft glow of the screen. "That's exactly what we're doing," Alistair replied. But the most powerful messages weren't shown on the map. They came in the form of emails and voice notes that the small team would share with each other, often at the end of a long day, to remind themselves why they were doing this. One afternoon, Maya came into Alistair's office, her eyes red-rimmed. She wordlessly played a voice note on her phone. A man's voice, rough with emotion, filled the room. "My name is David," the voice said. "I'm a former soldier. For years the nights were the worst part. The memories, the hypervigilance. It was like my brain was still back there on patrol. Sleeping pills just made me foggy, but the nightmares still got through. A buddy told me about your site. I listened to the one about the deep sea vents and the weird life down there. I was so focused on how life could survive without sunlight and all that pressure. I guess my brain finally stood down from its post. I slept for 6 hours straight. For the first time in a decade, I woke up feeling like I'd actually rested. Thank you. It's a different kind of peace." The room was silent after the message ended. Alistair looked at Maya, and he didn't need to ask why she had been crying. They both felt the immense weight of that gratitude. Another message came from a woman named Sarah. She was a primary caregiver for her mother, who had Alzheimer's. Her life was a cycle of stress, worry, and exhaustion. "Your episode about why cats purr," she wrote. "I put it on just to distract myself for 10 minutes. I learned that purring isn't just for happiness. It's also a self-healing mechanism for bones and muscles. That simple, beautiful fact. It just wrapped around my anxiety like a blanket. I felt like the world for a moment made sense. I felt like I could handle the next day." These stories became the real fuel for their work. They weren't just helping people fall asleep. They were providing a moment of order in the chaos, a rope to hold on to in a stormy sea of thoughts. The team started to grow organically. A linguist professor offered to help coordinate translations. A music student composed a few simple, soft instrumental themes that could be used as an introduction. They never charged any money. It remained a free resource funded by a small university grant and a lot of volunteer passion. One evening, Eleanor came to the lab to record a new batch of Enigmas. She had seen some of the messages from around the world. Before she started, she sat with Alistair, a cup of tea in her hands. "You know," she said, looking around the humble lab, "I used to narrate films about saving endangered species or exploring the rings of Saturn. They were grand, important projects. But reading that note from the soldier, or the woman caring for her sick mother," her voice caught. "This feels more important. This is immediate. This is healing, one person, one night at a time." Alistair nodded. He knew exactly what she meant. The project had surpassed his original hypothesis. It was no longer just about cognitive closure. It was about human connection. It was about reminding people that even in their most alone and anxious moments, a voice from across the world could tell them a story that would make them feel safe, that would make the world feel understandable, if just for a few minutes. He looked back at the world map on the monitor, now glowing with hundreds of little lights. It looked like a constellation of hope, a galaxy of quiet minds finding rest, all connected by the simple, powerful thread of a story well told. They had set out to explain enigmas, and in doing so, they had become a small, but significant, answer to one of the biggest enigmas of all: how to find a moment of peace in a noisy world. The Sleep to Science project had become a quiet giant. It didn't have the flashy fame of a viral video, but it had something deeper: trust. Millions of people around the world now knew that voice, that calm, certain rhythm that could guide them away from their worries and into rest. One morning, a thick, formal envelope arrived for Alistair. It was an invitation to speak at the Future of Human Wellness conference, one of the biggest stages in his field. They wanted him to present his findings not as a small sleep study, but as a case study in applied cognitive closure. The invitation was an honor, but it filled Alistair with a deep nervousness. He was a researcher, comfortable in his lab or his classroom. The thought of standing under bright lights in front of thousands of people, with other famous scientists and thinkers watching, made his hands feel cold. The day of the conference arrived. Backstage, Alistair adjusted his tie for the 10th time, his notes feeling flimsy and useless in his hands. Maya, who had come along for moral support, gave him a thumbs up. "Just talk about the people," she whispered. "Forget the data. Talk about your dad." When his name was called, Alistair walked onto the vast, dark stage, a single spotlight making him squint. The audience was a sea of silent, expectant faces. He placed his notes on the podium, took a deep breath, and began. "For most of my career," he started, his voice echoing slightly in the huge hall, "I believed that the goal of knowledge was to wake us up, to make us more alert, more critical, more engaged." He clicked a button, and a giant graph appeared on the screen behind him, the sharp, red, anxious lines from his original student sleep study. A few people in the audience nodded in recognition. "But a few years ago," he continued, "I saw that the very tools we use to gain knowledge, our phones, our screens, were having the opposite effect. They were overloading the system. They were feeding our ancient brains a constant, terrifying diet of unsolvable problems. And it was making us sick with worry. It was keeping us awake." He then showed the world map from their website, now glowing with millions of tiny points of light. A soft murmur went through the crowd. "We thought we had a problem with information," Alistair said, his voice growing stronger. "But we were wrong. The problem wasn't information. It was resolution." He then did something the conference organizers hadn't expected. He stepped away from the podium and stood in the center of the stage, under the light, like a storyteller. "I'd like to tell you about 3 people," he said. He talked about Ben, the software developer from their first study, whose brainwave scan showed that abrupt, beautiful drop into sleep the moment a scientific explanation was complete. For Ben, a solved problem was a permission slip for his mind to rest. Then he talked about his father, Arthur. He described the proud, stubborn man lying awake in the dark, tormented by static. He shared the vulnerable moment of playing the déjà vu Enigma and the profound peace of watching his father finally sleep. For my dad, it wasn't about the facts. It was about the feeling that the world, for a moment, made sense. Finally, he played the voice note from David, the former soldier. The man's emotionally raw testimony, his words, "a different kind of peace," echoed through the silent conference hall. You could have heard a pin drop. "When we started," Alistair said, looking out at the audience, "we thought we were fighting insomnia. But we weren't. We were fighting a feeling of helplessness. We weren't trying to close people's minds. We were trying to open a door out of the prison of their own anxiety." He clicked to his final slide. It wasn't a graph or a chart. It was a simple black screen with a single elegant line of text in white. "We didn't discover a new particle or a new law of physics. We simply remembered that the human mind, in its search for truth, ultimately seeks rest." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Knowledge doesn't have to be a stimulant. It can be a sedative. It doesn't have to shout. It can whisper. And in that whisper, there is a profound power to heal." We gave the world permission to learn, and in doing so, to let go. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the applause started. It wasn't the polite, brief clapping from earlier talks. It was a rising wave of sound, warm and sustained. People were on their feet. After his talk, as he was surrounded by well-wishers, an older woman, a famous neuroscientist whose work Alistair had admired for years, took his hand. "You've given a name to something we've all felt," she said, her eyes sharp and kind. "You've shown that in an age of infinite questions, a single beautiful answer is a form of therapy. Thank you." Later that night, in his hotel room, Alistair felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The nervousness was gone, replaced by a solid certainty. He had taken their simple idea, born from a daughter's bedtime story and a father's sleepless night, and he had shared it with the world. And the world had understood. He looked at his phone, at the familiar interface of the Sleep to Science app. He had come full circle. He scrolled to a new enigma, one he hadn't heard before. He put in his earbuds, lay down in the dark, and pressed play. Eleanor's voice, that trusted, gentle guide, began. "Tonight's enigma is one that has puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries. The reason we dream," Alistair smiled, closed his eyes, and let the story of solved mysteries carry him away, just like everyone else. Time has a way of smoothing out the edges of even the most exciting journeys. The bright spotlight of the conference faded, the debates with critics like Julian Croft became old news, and the Sleep to Science project settled into a comfortable, steady rhythm. It was no longer a groundbreaking experiment. It had become a familiar, trusted friend to millions. Alistair's life had changed, but in quiet ways. He still taught his classes at the university, but now his students looked at him with a different kind of respect. They saw someone who had taken knowledge from the classroom and used it to touch the real world. He was still Dr. Finch, but he was also the man who helped their cousins, their grandparents, and themselves find sleep. His relationship with his father, Arthur, found a new warmth. It wasn't that they suddenly agreed on everything. Arthur was still a man of gut feelings, and Alistair still loved his data. But now there was a bridge between them. Sometimes when Alistair called, his father would say, "That Eleanor woman was talking about lightning last night. Did you know we still don't know why it shoots upwards into space? Sprites, they call them. Still a mystery." And they would have a real conversation, not about the weather, but about the wonders of the world, both solved and unsolved. The team, though scattered, remained connected. Maya had graduated and taken a job with a major tech company, but on her LinkedIn profile, right at the top, it said, "Co-creator of Sleep to Science." It was the work she was proudest of. Leo had started his own successful audio production company, his career launched by that one reckless, brilliant decision to upload those first 3 episodes. And Eleanor Vance, the voice of calm, found a late career renaissance. She was no longer just the narrator of old documentaries. She was the voice that sings the world to sleep. She received letters from parents who played the episodes for their restless children, and from those children, now grown, who said her voice was the sound of safety they remembered from their childhood. One evening, a few years after the project began, Alistair found himself in his now familiar routine. The house was quiet. He had just finished grading a stack of papers. The day's worries and to-do lists were swirling in his head like a swarm of gnats. He felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw that meant a restless night was waiting for him. He knew what to do. He went to his bedroom, but he didn't reach for a sleeping pill. He didn't pick up his phone to scroll through the news. Instead, he picked up a small, simple speaker he kept on his nightstand. He opened the Sleep to Science app on his phone. There were now hundreds of Enigmas to choose from, translated into dozens of languages. He scrolled through the list, a library of answered questions. The mystery of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The reason for yawning. How a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. He selected one. It was Enigma number 100, a special one Eleanor had recorded to mark their milestone. He hadn't listened to it yet. The title was simple and perfect. The Reason We Need Sleep. He got into bed, turned off the light, and pressed play. Eleanor's voice filled the darkness, as familiar and comforting as his own heartbeat. "For centuries," she began, her tone soft and reflective, "sleep was the greatest enigma of all. It was a little death, a blank space in our lives. Why would evolution design us to spend a third of our lives in such a vulnerable, unproductive state?" Alistair smiled in the dark. He knew the science, of course. He had studied it for years. But he wasn't listening as a scientist tonight. He was listening as a tired man. Eleanor began to walk him through the journey of discovery. She talked about the brain, not as a cold computer, but as a busy city. During the day, the streets were full of traffic, thoughts, sensations, memories, all leaving behind a kind of mental litter. And while we sleep, she explained, her voice a gentle whisper, the city's cleaning crew comes out. A dedicated network flushes out the toxic waste that builds up between brain cells. Our memories from the day are sorted, some filed away for long-term storage, others gently let go. It is a time of active essential maintenance, a restoration, a healing. She described it not as a shutdown, but as a vital, beautiful process of renewal. The mystery of sleep wasn't about switching off. It was about the deep, biological work that makes being awake possible. Alistair felt his own body relaxing. His breathing slowed, matching the calm rhythm of her speech. The gnats of worry in his mind were settling. They were being gently sorted and put away. And so, Eleanor concluded, her voice fading to a soft, almost dreamlike murmur, we do not sleep to escape the world. We sleep to engage with it more fully. We sleep to clean the house of the mind, to mend the tears of the day, to prepare ourselves for the wonder of tomorrow. The great daily mystery of sleep is the body's most profound and necessary act of self-care. A mystery lovingly solved. The recording ended. There was only silence. Alistair didn't move. He felt the weight of the blankets, the softness of the pillow. The day's chaos was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet understanding. His mind, having followed the final, beautiful puzzle to its conclusion, had nothing left to do. He had spent years giving this gift to others. Tonight, he finally gave himself the permission to fully receive it. In the peaceful darkness, Dr. Alistair Finch, the man who fought the world's anxiety with answered questions, closed his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't think about data or enigmas or the future. He just listened to the quiet rhythm of his own breath and let the silence carry him into a deep and well-earned slumber.